Atom Symbol Series. China's Nuclear Secrets. Movie Camera Episode 2. The Soviet Union and the First Drop of Nuclear Milk. The north wind swept across the Manchurian plains, blowing along the icy steel rails stretching southward. That night, in October 1955, endless trains slithered into Beijing, carrying something the Chinese people at the time knew only by one name: the secret of a new era. Inside the sealed carriages were not food supplies or weapons, but blocks of lead-encased metal, massive measuring instruments, thick cables as wide as a grown man's wrist, and crates of documents printed in Russian. Only a handful of people at the top knew the truth. This was the first drop of milk from the Soviet elder brother, the nourishment for a giant child yet to be born, China's nuclear program. That October, China and the Soviet Union signed a secret pact, the Agreement on National Defense and Atomic Energy Cooperation. After years of anticipation, Mao Zedong's long-awaited promise finally came true. The first nuclear reactor would be built, and the first Soviet experts would set foot in the land of the Red Revolution. They arrived in silence. Most of the Soviet scientists had worked in Igor Kurchatov's research institutes, the father of the Soviet atomic bomb. They stepped off the plane, eyes scanning the dry, chilly air of Beijing. They brought with them technology, documentation, methods for processing uranium, and blueprints for water graphite reactors. For the Chinese, these things were like a doorway into a divine realm, a place where the power to destroy worlds was contained within the nucleus of matter. But to understand why Mao Zedong could receive this gift, we must go back a few years, to the end of the Korean War. In 1953, the brutal conflict on the Korean peninsula ended in blood and smoke. More than 180,000 Chinese soldiers had died in the north, trading their lives for a borderline that barely changed. What Mao gained was not just peace, but a bitter truth: the Soviet Union possessed nuclear weapons. The United States did too, and both superpowers could annihilate entire nations within hours. Meanwhile, China, the most populous nation on earth, had nothing but crude firearms and iron will. Mao understood that willpower could not stop an atomic bomb. In a closed meeting, he famously said, "Those who have the bomb speak, those who don't have it listen." This sentence became an obsession at Zhang Nan's highest levels. From the Ministry of Defense to scientific committees, from professors at Tsinghua University to young engineers sent to Moscow, everyone knew that only nuclear power could make the world listen to China. In 1954, a top-secret plan was drafted at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Titled, National Atomic Energy Research Plan. It was the first time the term, nuclear reactor, appeared in an official Beijing government document. But without the Soviet Union, that plan was nothing more than a distant dream. At the time, the Soviet Union was at the height of the Khrushchev era. After Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev sought to prove he was not merely inheriting a dictatorship but was also the architect of Sino-Soviet peace. He needed China, a massive Asian ally, to counter Western pressure. And Mao needed the Soviet Union, not for protection, but to learn how to wield the power of destruction. This exchange between two seasoned revolutionaries played out like a chess match full of hidden moves. Mao pledged loyalty to the socialist path. Khrushchev responded by opening the vault of Soviet nuclear technology, something even Eastern European countries had never been allowed to touch. Over the next 2 years, hundreds of Chinese students, engineers, and physicists were sent to Moscow, Leningrad, Dubna, and secret cities around the Urals. They studied uranium fission, chain reactions, neutron mechanics, and how to calculate reactor safety coefficients. These were the classrooms of those who dreamed of artificial suns, and of those who were playing with death. In the damp dormitories on the outskirts of Moscow, young Chinese students often gathered at night, murmuring nuclear reaction equations in both Russian and Mandarin. One of them, physicist Qian Sanchang, later called the father of China's atomic bomb, wrote in his diary, "I know that if we fail, we will become the world's laughingstock. But if we succeed, we will change the destiny of a nation." These people, silent, proud, and solitary, were the seeds of China's nuclear program. Back home, the Soviet Union began shipping the first crates. In February 1955, a delegation of over 300 Soviet experts was sent to China. Working in research institutes in Beijing, Shanghai, and Lanzhou, they brought blueprints, diagrams, and radiation analysis equipment that China had never been able to produce. In the pine forests on the western outskirts of Beijing, a secret construction site was established. Official name: Beijing Institute of Nuclear Research, CIAE. Unofficial name among engineers: Area 221. That area would, in the years to come, become the birthplace of the first nuclear reaction on Chinese soil. But before the first neutrons could multiply, there was still a long road ahead, one filled with uncertainty and mistrust. The Soviets arrived with the posture of big brothers. They gave orders, directed everything, and sometimes looked down on their Asian pupils. The Chinese, proud and sensitive, felt both grateful and resentful. Inside the laboratories, surrounded by Soviet-style radiation detectors, the tension was so thick it could be felt in every breath. Qian Sancheng later recalled during a meeting, "They taught us step by step, but never explained why. They told us to assemble, but never showed us the final blueprints." The drop of nuclear milk that China was drinking was both sweet and bitter. Beijing's winter mornings in 1956 were bone-cuttingly cold. Inside, Area 221, hundreds of Chinese workers and engineers wrapped cotton scarves around their necks. Working amidst the harsh clanging of metal, none of them were allowed to speak of what they were building. All they knew was that every brick, every pipe, every bolt was a mission for the nation. At the center of the construction site, Soviet experts in thick coats held oil paper blueprints, directing every detail. Language was a major barrier. The Chinese engineers only vaguely understood Russian, and few Soviets spoke Chinese. Technical meetings became performances of glances, gestures, and chalk on blackboards. A tiny miscalculation could lead to disaster, yet both sides endured this awkwardness. Because they were chasing something far greater, the power of the gods. The young Chinese, students of Qian Sancheng and Wang Ganchang, were learning more than techniques. They were learning how to think nuclear, a mindset possessed by only a few nations. Every day, they took notes like monks chanting sutras, copying every formula and diagram. One night in the dormitory, a young engineer asked Qian, "Teacher, will we ever be able to build an atomic bomb by ourselves?" Qian was silent for a long time, then whispered, barely audible, "We have no other choice." That answer spread like an unspoken order. In every person, from workers to scientists, a shared conviction began to take root: China could not depend on others forever. By mid-1956, the Soviet Union had completed the transfer of designs for a small EVA-type research reactor. Using uranium as fuel and light water as moderator, it wasn't the type that could make bombs, but it was the foundation of all nuclear technology, the first drop of milk Khrushchev gave to his little brother. A team of Soviet engineers supervised the construction of the reactor core while Chinese scientists carefully measured and recorded every detail. Yet they remained limited. The Soviets never handed over the full reactor physics secrets. Some sections of the design were encrypted, some documents remained in Moscow. This cooperation resembled a classroom where the teacher kept the key to the knowledge vault. Mao knew this, but he was patient. In a Zhongnane meeting, he told his commissioners, "The Russians won't give us everything, but if they give us 10 parts, we'll figure out the remaining 90 ourselves." Once the steel framework of the reactor was installed, Beijing ordered total secrecy. Armed police guarded the site 24/7. All documents entering or leaving were double-sealed. It was said that some engineers lived inside the research facility for months without returning home to prevent leaks. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Khrushchev still saw the project as a political gift, a symbol of Sino-Soviet brotherhood. He once said at a meeting, "We cannot let Comrade Mao fall behind. If China is weak, socialism in Asia will be surrounded." But behind those words lay caution. The Soviets knew that if China mastered nuclear secrets, this little brother might one day turn his back. Autumn 1957, Moscow, a pivotal moment. Khrushchev invited Mao to the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution. In a smoke-filled conference room, the two leaders shook hands, their smiles stiff. Beneath the table, technical agreements were signed. The USSR would help China build its first nuclear reactor and a uranium isotope separation facility. But only a few in the Chinese delegation knew that Khrushchev had also made an oral promise to assist in nuclear weapons development, a promise he would later break. Starting in 1957, the Soviet expert mission expanded to over 1,400 people. They came from the Kurchatov Institute, from weapons plants in Sverdlovsk, from the secret facilities where the USSR had forged its first bomb. In a small meeting room in Beijing, technical maps were spread out, cooling pipes, uranium fuel rods, reactor chamber layouts. Qian Sancheng pointed at each part, asking rapid-fire questions, while Soviet engineers patiently responded in clumsy mixes of Russian and Chinese. They all knew what they were doing, changing the world order. September 27, 1958. Inside the main control room of Beijing's reactor, the dials moved slowly. The air was heavy, silent. Engineers stared at the neutron flux indicators, red lights blinked. A young engineer placed his hand on the start button, glanced at the Soviet expert beside him. The Russian nodded. The neutron needle began to tremble. The chain reaction started. After 3 relentless years, China had officially entered the nuclear age. As the indicator lights stabilized, the control room erupted in soft applause that grew louder. Some embraced, some wept. In the CIAE Institute logbook, a shaky line of black ink was written. The first light water reactor has successfully started up. Today, China can say, "We have joined the ranks of nuclear nations." Mao received the news while in Changsha. He did not express joy. He simply said slowly, "Good, now, we will make our own bomb." That night, in the research compound, a Chinese engineer sat at his desk and wrote in his notebook. "The Russians gave us milk, but to grow up, we must learn to chew bone." Outside, snow began to fall. Beneath the warm glow of the reactor, China, a nation that had endured a century of humiliation, had touched a power once reserved for empires. But they did not know that at that very moment in Moscow, Khrushchev had begun to regret his generosity. After the reactor went online, China felt like someone who had opened the door to a new era. Internal publications repeated the phrase, "atomic energy for peace." But behind closed doors, the true meaning was very different. The defense commissioners, scientists, and Mao himself all understood, for peace was a facade. What they wanted was the atomic bomb, the ultimate symbol of power. In October 1958, amid the fervor of the Great Leap Forward, Mao ordered the establishment of the National Defense Science Commission, under Marshal Ni Rongjun. Its mission: prepared China's first steps toward making an atomic bomb. But there was a problem. The Soviets still held tightly to weapons technology. In bilateral technical meetings, the Chinese repeatedly requested the transfer of tactical nuclear weapon blueprints. The Soviets were silent, evasive. Whenever Chinese experts asked about the principles of fission detonation, the Russians replied vaguely, "That issue is too sensitive." Invisible walls of suspicion began to rise between the two sides. At an internal meeting in Beijing, Qian Sancheng, newly appointed head of the Institute of Physics, stated bluntly, "If we only learn how to use, but never how to build, we will always be followers." Ni Rongjun nodded, his voice raspy from cigarettes. "We have the foundation. If they won't give it, we must make it ourselves." When those words reached Mao, he underlined them in bold red ink in a classified document. Self-reliance. Do not depend on the Soviet Union. From then on, their paths diverged, though they still ran in parallel shadows. Meanwhile, Khrushchev was locked in an intense standoff with the West. The USSR launched Sputnik, the US was shaken. The world saw Moscow as the symbol of scientific power. But deep inside, Khrushchev began to fear that the little brother in the East would become an equal. Unwilling to submit, he confided to his advisors in a closed Kremlin meeting. "The Chinese have too much ambition. If they get the bomb, They won't listen to us anymore. With that remark, the fate of Sino-Soviet nuclear cooperation was sealed. Spring 1959. The Beijing research complex remained lit through the night. Damp brick buildings surrounded the concrete yard. In the labs, young scientists bent over uranium samples, examining radioactive particles with outdated Soviet instruments. Many didn't know that at the same time, the Soviets had stopped shipping critical components for the second reactor. Crates scheduled to arrive in March never came. Engineers sent urgent cables to Moscow. The reply arrived 3 weeks later. Delayed for technical reasons. But everyone knew. This was a delay with no end date. Khrushchev visited Beijing in August 1959. The atmosphere was tense. Inside the Great Hall of the People, the two leaders sat face to face. Mao didn't smile, neither did Khrushchev. When nuclear cooperation was brought up, Khrushchev spoke lightly. We believe nuclear weapons should not proliferate further. The world is dangerous enough. Mao stared back and replied, the world is dangerous, but only for the weak. Nothing more needed to be said. That exchange cut through the once celebrated Sino-Soviet brotherhood like a knife. After the meeting, Khrushchev ordered Soviet experts to withdraw from Beijing. Engineers who had lived at the research site began packing. They said no goodbyes. One night in late October, convoys carrying equipment, documents, and unfinished blueprints quietly left China, heading north. As the trucks crossed the North Gate Bridge, some Chinese engineers stood silently, watching the red tail lights disappear into the mist. They knew. The Big Brother's train had departed forever. Behind, Qian Sancheng opened a new notebook. He wrote the first line. From today onward, everything we do will be our own. No one in that room knew that only 6 years later, China's first atomic bomb would detonate in the Lop Nur Desert. But the seed of that moment was planted here when the Russians left, leaving behind a burning void. In the shadows of Area 221, figures worked tirelessly. No more Soviet experts, no more detailed blueprints, no more nuclear milk from Moscow. Only willpower and obsession. An unnamed young engineer wrote in his diary, we were once students, but now, we must become our own teachers. The hum of machines blended with the northern wind. Outside, snow blanketed the metal pipes. In a small control room at the heart of the facility, Qian Sancheng stared at the dimly glowing reactor core. The light reflected off his prematurely aged face. He murmured to himself, you cannot learn to walk forever on someone else's legs. The reactor continued to run. China now had its own nuclear foundation. But at the same time, the era of Sino-Soviet nuclear cooperation ended, leaving a deep rift in the socialist world. In Moscow, Khrushchev said at a meeting, they are too impatient. They want to surpass us. They will build it themselves. And then they will destroy themselves. In Beijing, Mao smiled coldly when he heard the Soviets were withdrawing. They think we will collapse. But today is the day we truly begin. The last winter night of 1959. A group of young engineers worked through the night. They were redrawing uranium isotope separation equipment from memory. No original documents, no instructions, only instinct and blind faith in the future. One asked softly, what if we get it wrong? The other replied, then we fix it, but if we don't try, we'll always be followers. Outside, Beijing's sky was thick with fog. No one knew that just a few years later, China's nuclear flame would ignite in the desert, marking the beginning of a new chapter of self-reliance, one the entire world would turn to watch. No one left behind us. 1960. China awoke to a changed world. The Soviets had left, abandoning unfinished facilities, reactors not yet at full capacity, and thousands of unanswered technical questions. In Beijing, a red-stamped order was issued. All Soviet experts to leave China before September. No explanation, no promises. Trains carrying thousands of Soviet engineers quietly departed stations in Changchun, Harbin, Shanghai, and Beijing, taking with them blueprints, machinery, and the core data of nuclear physics. When the carriage doors closed, China fell into a knowledge void. Inside the research institutes, the air was heavy like lead. Many young scientists sat in silence for hours before uranium analyzers, machines no one fully knew how to operate anymore. Some equipment had been stripped of key components before the Soviets left, leaving behind only empty steel shells. Like a cold warning. You are not ready. But in that atmosphere of despair, something else was kindled, the will to stand on their own. In Beijing, Marshal Ni Rongjun convened an emergency meeting. On the table lay a massive map of China, dotted with red marks, the remaining active nuclear research sites. Ni spoke slowly, his voice deep and firm. From today onward, there is no Soviet Union, no Big Brother. There is no one but ourselves. If we fail, no one will help, but if we succeed, the entire world will have to look again. He paused for a moment, then articulated each word clearly. This is no longer a scientific project. This is a struggle for national survival. From that moment, a top-secret campaign was launched, Project 596, the code name for China's first atomic bomb program. But 596 was not just a number. It became a symbol of a vow, born from humiliation and pride. Roughly 3,000 remaining engineers and scientists in China's nuclear establishment were reassigned to new facilities in the northwest. An anonymous desert in Xinjiang was chosen as the future testing site. A new research institute was built deep in the mountains, a place that would later be known as Base 221. They moved in silence, passing through barren lands with no electricity, no water. Their trucks carried nothing but radiation detectors, blueprints, and notebooks filled with dense mathematical symbols. No one awaited them there. Only wind, sand, and a blue sky vast enough to swallow their solitude. In Beijing, Mao Zedong remained steadfast. He declared during a Politburo meeting, "We have no foreign experts, but we have millions of Chinese. If we lack pure uranium, we will refine it. If we lack centrifuges, we will build them. The world has the bomb, and so must we." Those words, once transmitted down to the scientific community, became absolute orders. No one dared to question. No one was allowed to be slow. Meanwhile, outside, the country was plunged into crisis. The Great Leap Forward had failed. Famine spread. Tens of millions perished. But in the desolate expanses of the Gobi Desert, research lamps still glowed through the night. People ate dry corn cakes, drank brine, slept on frozen dirt floors, but no one left their post. One scientist would later recall, "We didn't know whether we would succeed or die there. But we knew if we gave up, our descendants would never hold their heads high again." December 1960. Inside a testing bunker at Base 221, a team of engineers began assembling China's first completely homemade fission reaction model. There were no calibrated instruments. No original blueprints. Everything had to be reconstructed from memory, from fragments of knowledge left behind. A tiny miscalculation could blow up the entire lab. But they kept going. At the first experiment, the trigger current was switched on. Light flickered from the reaction chamber, weak but real. A young engineer whispered, "We have lit our own light." No one said anything more. Only the soft hum of metal and the long exhale of years of fear filled the room. The nation knew nothing of this. But in a small office in Beijing, a short message was delivered directly to Mao. First autonomous reaction, successful. Mao read it in silence. Then he told Zhou Enlai, softly but firmly, "Good, we've taken the first step." That night, snow began to fall over the desert. Under the quiet sky, guards patrolled the research site. No one knew what they were protecting, only that it was the nation's greatest secret. A young scientist wrote in his notebook, "If one day this bomb explodes, I want to hear its sound, just once, before I die." This note would later be found in a rusty cabinet at Base 221. No one ever learned the author's name. The uranium particles in the dark. Summer 1961. The Gobi Desert sun burned everything. Winds carried sand and uranium dust over faded tents. Amid this treeless wilderness, hundreds of scientists and soldiers dug deep into the ground, searching for what they called the gold vein of the century, natural uranium. None of them were allowed to say what they were searching for. On paper, it was the National Defense Geological Mining Project. But they knew. Each grain of ore lifted from the earth could one day become fuel for a bomb powerful enough to shift the global balance of power. In Beijing, Mao issued a directive. China must control its own uranium supply. Without materials, all theory is just paper. Thus Operation 101 was launched, mobilizing tens of thousands of engineers, laborers, and even political prisoners to survey uranium deposits across the country: Guizhou, Gansu, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, Sichuan. A diary entry from one engineer read shakily, "We work in the dark, among rocks and dust. No one knows our names. No one knows what we do. Only that every time we find a piece of ore, we are one day closer to the bomb." But raw uranium was just the first step. To build a bomb, China needed highly enriched uranium-235, separated through enrichment, a technology held by only a handful of nations. With the Soviets gone, they had to reinvent the process from scratch. In a makeshift lab in Lanzhou, a group of young physicists began constructing a manual isotope separation system using gaseous diffusion of uranium hexafluoride, UF6. Lacking specialized materials, they used homemade steel pipes, rubber gaskets cut from truck tires, and handcrafted metal filters. They worked in rooms above 40 degrees Celsius with no ventilation, surrounded by the hiss of pumps and the sharp sting of chemicals. When UF6 gas leaked, some suffered burns, others fainted. But no one left their station. When asked why they didn't rest, one engineer simply replied, "If we don't do it, who will?" Chalkboards were filled with dense equations, gas flow rates, diffusion ratios, thermodynamic pressures. A single error, one ruptured valve, could turn the lab into a hellscape. The remaining Soviet documents became treasured relics. But the most crucial formulas had been deliberately erased. A Chinese scientist would later say, "We had drawings with only half a page left, diagrams with key symbols scratched out, as if they wanted us to grope in the dark." But it was in that darkness that we learned how to see the light. And indeed, within that chaos, China began to find its own path. At the Beijing Institute of Nuclear Research, experts pursued two parallel directions. The first focused on uranium enrichment for a traditional atomic bomb. The second explored plutonium production through breeder reactors, capable of regenerating fuel from depleted uranium. This was a bold decision. If successful, China could leap into a field where even Britain and France still struggled. Outside the labs, however, was a living hell. The famine raged across the country. People starved in the streets. But in Lanzhou, engineers sat on concrete floors, eating dry rice, drinking plain water, working 16-hour days. One recalled, "We ate less than soldiers on the front, but we believed we were fighting a war without gunfire." This was more than science, it was a kind of faith, the belief that the nation's survival depended on their success. March 1962. For the first time, China produced low-enriched uranium reaching 1.4% U-235. Small, but miraculous. No longer mere students, China had officially entered the ranks of nations capable of independent uranium enrichment. That night, in the narrow Lanzhou lab, scientists opened a bottle of rice wine to share. One raised his cup and said softly, "We don't have Russian vodka. But this wine, it warms me more." They laughed. Dry, weary laughs, but real. Outside, desert winds howled through barbed wire fences, like distant echoes of history. The report sent to Beijing was typed carefully. China has separated uranium-235 through gaseous diffusion. Project 596 enters a new phase. Marshal Ni Rongjun read the report and said nothing. Witnesses later recounted that when he stepped outside, his eyes were red. Thousands of kilometers away in Wuhan, Mao received the news during a meeting. He spoke briefly. "Good, work faster. The world will not wait for us." That sentence became a slogan hanging across nuclear institutes. The world will not wait for us. Winter 1962. Snow covered the research huts in the desert. A group of engineers worked through the night, assembling a homemade neutron detection system. Lacking imported sensors, they soldered wires by hand and polished each optical lens themselves. At 3 a.m., they flipped the switch. A faint blue glow emerged, Cherenkov radiation, emitted when high-energy particles moved through transparent matter. It was the heartbeat of a living reactor. An engineer collapsed onto the floor, laughing wordlessly. He scribbled in his notebook, "We made the neutrons sing." The next morning, the report went out. The last line read, "China has demonstrated the ability to independently sustain a fission reaction." For the outside world, this might have seemed like a technical note. For those inside, it was the breath of a nation. For the first time, with no Soviets, no foreign experts, China had touched the core of nuclear power with its own hands. Late at night, in a tent beneath the desert stars, an old scientist looked up and whispered to his colleague, "We don't know when the bomb will explode, but I believe when it does, the world will never underestimate China again." The young colleague stayed silent, nodding. Outside, the cold wind howled over the sands, carrying the chill of the distant Tianshan Mountains. But inside, within exhausted hearts, a quiet fire burned, a fire no storm could extinguish. Spring 1963. Winds swept over the low buildings at Lop Nur, Xinjiang. Few knew this place would become a landmark in nuclear history. Local villagers merely saw military convoys entering silently at night, carrying huge sealed metal containers marked with radiation symbols. No one was allowed to ask. No one could answer. At the center of this area, deep underground, tunnels were being dug hundreds of meters down, China's secret nuclear test site. Codename: Base 221. Inside, thousands of engineers, scientists, soldiers, and political prisoners worked day and night. There were no radio signals, no letters. All communication with the outside world was completely cut off. Those who entered Base 221 understood one thing clearly. They might never come back. At the same time in Beijing, Project 596 had entered its final phase, producing weapons-grade plutonium, the heart of China's first atomic bomb. At the Jiaquan base in Gansu province, the plutonium production reactor was undergoing trial operation. A colossal steel structure, 12 meters high and weighing thousands of tons, held hundreds of uranium fuel rods cooled by heavy water. It was China's first artificial heart, and also the most dangerous heart in the world. Hundreds of engineers worked in silence, accompanied only by the sounds of pumps, the metallic tremor of the reactor, and neutron warning sirens. No one spoke much. They all knew a single mistake could wipe out the entire complex. One engineer wrote in his notebook, "We no longer fear death. What truly terrifies us is failure." To refine plutonium, China had to build an entire chemical separation line to extract it from irradiated uranium, an extremely complex process in which an operator could die from inhaling just a few radioactive particles. There were no robots, no automated systems. Chinese technicians used lead gloves, thick glass face shields, and long tongs like giant chopsticks to work in radioactive environments. Every misstep was a slow death sentence. Some engineers suffered severe radiation exposure, their hair fell out, their skin blistered, yet they asked to stay on the job. One of them, engineer Zhang Zhenhuan, once said, "If we retreat, who will protect this country?" No one answered. Only silence. A silence colder than the reactor's steel. August 1963. For the first time, China obtained a few grams of pure plutonium, just enough to prove they had mastered the once secret Soviet technology. When the sample glowed faintly blue under the microscope, the entire laboratory fell silent. Someone whispered, "This is the soul of the sun." The sentence was recorded in the official report of Project 596, a poetic line buried inside a cold technical document. Behind this success, however, loomed a political storm. In 1963, the Cold War was escalating. The United States was testing thermonuclear bombs across the Pacific. while the Soviet Union signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty without consulting China. Mao was furious. He saw it as a betrayal. During a meeting at Jiangnan, Mao slammed his hand on the table, his deep voice echoing, "They want us to submit. They signed treaties to keep the bomb for themselves. But we will never bow." The room fell into dead silence. Then Mao gave the order. No matter the cost, the world must see China's bomb explode. The sooner, the better. That winter, snow-blanketed Lop Nur. Through icy winds and desert cold, convoys carried components of the first atomic bomb to the test site. Inside the steel containers was the plutonium core, the cold light forged by the blood and bones of thousands. They gave it a simple name. Object Number 1. No one was allowed to say, bomb. All documents referred to it as Scientific Device 596. In the final weeks of 1963, teams of engineers worked around the clock to perfect the detonation system. Neutron initiators, and spherical implosion structure, a device where an error of mere thousandths of a second would turn the bomb into a useless lump of metal. They had no modern computers, only slide rules and smuggled Swiss mechanical calculators. Every calculation was checked dozens of times. One engineer remarked, "We calculated like monks chanting sutras, afraid to be off by a single breath." Early 1964. All the pieces were ready. Project 596 moved into the stage of assembling the actual weapon. Deep underground at Base 221, beneath hundreds of meters of sand, China began putting together its first atomic bomb. It was said that on the night of assembly, a sandstorm raged outside. Inside, dozens of scientists in protective suits and thick goggles carefully lifted each component with trembling hands and lead tongs. No one dared to speak loudly. Only the ticking of the countdown clock broke the silence. Everyone understood, if they succeeded, China would join the ranks of nuclear powers. If they failed, they would all perish. In Marshal Ni Rongzhen's diary, there was a single trembling line written in black ink. "We lost millions of lives to famine. But we must not lose the soul of our nation. This bomb is not to kill, it is to keep others from killing us." That sentence was later engraved on the Project 596 memorial stone at Lop Nur. On the final night before full assembly, a young scientist quietly left the underground chamber and gazed at the sky. He asked his comrade, "Do you think the world will believe that miserable people like us could build a bomb?" The other replied, "We don't need them to believe. We only need them to fear." They looked at each other, then returned to the chamber. Their silhouettes disappeared into the sand and wind, where a new era for China was taking shape, in silence. In darkness, with unyielding resolve. Summer 1959. A top-secret cable from Moscow arrived in Beijing, stamped by the Soviet Politburo. It contained only a few cold lines. The Soviet Union will temporarily suspend the provision of nuclear bomb blueprints to China. No explanation. No warning. Mao read the cable without speaking for 5 minutes. Then he looked up at his advisors. "They see us as students. But don't forget, one day, students must leave the classroom." The room froze. Everyone understood that the Sino-Soviet brotherhood was fracturing from within the heart of socialism itself. A few years earlier, when Mao was still hailed by Khrushchev as the great friend of the Soviet Union, the two countries had cooperated closely in every field: military, industrial, scientific. The USSR had sent over 10,000 experts to China. China sent thousands of students to Moscow, Leningrad, and Dubna. All over Beijing, Shanghai, Heilongjiang, factories, reactors, and laboratories rose in Soviet style. In those years, China learned almost everything: the structure of reactors, uranium enrichment cycles, even the calculation of nuclear trajectories. They were even promised a fully assembled bomb for study. But things changed after Stalin's death. When Nikita Khrushchev came to power, he didn't trust Mao. To him, Mao was too radical, too reckless, and too dangerous to possess nuclear weapons. When Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, An ambitious campaign to turn China into an industrial power in a few years. Tens of millions died of famine. Moscow began to doubt Beijing's stability. A secret dialogue between the two sides was later recorded in a Soviet official's memoir. Mao: if the USSR is attacked by the US, we will send our troops. Khrushchev: good, but if China is hit by nuclear bombs, we can do nothing. You should think carefully. Mao, laughing: even if half of China dies, the other half will live. But without the bomb, our whole nation will always bow its head. That line cut the last thread of trust. In June 1959, the USSR unilaterally announced it would halt all nuclear cooperation with China. Over 1,400 Soviet experts were ordered to leave within 30 days. Blueprints were confiscated, equipment dismantled, and documents sealed, leaving projects unfinished. Chinese engineers were stunned. One recalled, "They disappeared overnight. The coffee cups were still warm. The lab benches still had tools, but the people were gone." The shock spread through Beijing. "We've been abandoned." On July 18, 1959, Mao convened an emergency meeting of the Central Military Commission. He slammed the table. "The Soviets want to use the bomb to control us. They let us taste a drop of milk, then snatch away the bottle. Fine, if they leave, we'll build it ourselves. Even if we have to bite the earth and eat grass, we must have the bomb." That sentence became a national command. Immediately afterward, Project 596 was officially restarted, this time entirely on China's own. No Soviet experts. No detailed blueprints. No sophisticated equipment. The entire Chinese nuclear program was blind in the desert. Young engineers had to figure everything out themselves. They dismantled neutron detectors to learn their structure. They melted alloys and calculated chain reactions with nothing but paper, pens, and blackboards. One engineer recalled, "We had only a half-translated Russian manual. Each page took a whole day to understand. But no one dared give up. Everything was scarce: food, fuel, medicine, even paper had to be reused." But determination was never in short supply. They called this period the years without a sun. No guidance, no light, only the belief that without the bomb, China would remain forever in someone else's shadow. Amid despair, leading scientists persevered. Qian Sanchang, trained in France, known as China's Joliot-Curie. Deng Jiaxin, a brilliant young engineer who secretly designed the implosion structure. Yu Min, later called the father of China's hydrogen bomb. They formed an underground nuclear team under tight military protection. No press, no names, no honors. Only one goal: finish the bomb as fast as possible. An internal memo from the Ministry of Defense read, "Project 596 is the highest state secret. Every document, every person, every breath within its scope belongs to the nation." Yu Min later recalled, "When the Soviets left, it felt like a storm had swept everything away. But then I realized, only the wind can forge steel." They rebuilt laboratories, fabricated each component by hand. Lacking pure uranium, they mined it themselves. Without gamma detectors, they improvised with glass tubes and copper wire. One engineer spent a month crafting a single piece of neutron-reflecting alloy, a common material in the USSR. But legendary in China at the time. Every small step was a victory. Every failure was a new oath: never stop. Meanwhile, the outside world had no idea that China was quietly building its own nuclear industry. Western newspapers scoffed. China, a country that cannot even feed its people, how could it possibly make an atomic bomb? No one believed. But in the heart of the Lop Nur Desert, nameless men and women kept working, digging tunnels, assembling devices, calculating thousands of implosion tests by hand. They didn't need the world to believe. They only needed one explosion, loud enough to silence the world. September 1964. The Chinese Ministry of Defense received a top-secret order: prepare for the first atomic bomb test. Codename 596, to commemorate the year the Soviets cut off aid. The report to Mao contained a single line: The device is ready. Mao nodded. Let the world know, China no longer bows its head. 10 a.m. October 16, 1964. Lop Nur Desert. A blinding flash. The ground shook. A massive mushroom cloud rose into the blue sky. That light illuminated a decade of struggle. Tens of thousands of lives. And a once humiliated nation now standing among the great powers. In the command bunker, Ni Rongjun said nothing. He quietly took out an old piece of paper on which Mao had written back in 1956. Even if we have to eat grass, we must have the bomb. He folded it carefully and put it back in his pocket. Outside, the desert wind blew, carrying away that solemn vow made years earlier.